You guys want me to do the opening reading thing?
Yes.
Bastard.
Better nail it in one take.
Okay. So, greetings. Welcome to the first inaugural episode from Three Friends Who Hate Each Other. I do kind of want to just, in the notes, I wrote, quote, something about acknowledging how everyone has a freaking podcast nowadays, and yet we're doing one. So I guess that's the acknowledgement. So there you go. So our idea about this was, and I think the why for me, for why we're doing this, making a podcast, is all about kind of like the dialogue, the communication piece of this. And I think I talked to you guys both about that I liked this idea of sitting down with friends and talking and just sharing ideas and hearing feedback. And I wrote that I like my friends and how they think, not necessarily meaning what they believe or their positions that they hold, but how they got there and their process, which was an honest process, their humility and their humor in that, along the way. And that was something for me that I wanted to continue in this. I liked the idea of sitting down with you guys and just talking about all those things. Obviously, we live in different cities now and separated by life. And the joy that I've had over the years of being able to just sit and discuss, talk, share, be challenged, and also, be intrigued was kind of the big appeal for me in this idea. So our goal is to simply do that, share what we believe, our process, its context, including much of our shared history and the upbringing in whatever topic that we may be talking about, and how that may have evolved, been synthesized or syncretized, and of course, for Adam and I to tell each other how much we hate one another for that. For your questions and glowing comments, you may email us at 3friendswhohateeachother@gmail.com. So, welcome to the first episode, which is titled Christian Evangelicalism in One's Upbringing. So, I think I wanted to start obviously with asking, that's a big kind of statement. Can you guys start by introducing yourselves and why you're doing this podcast?
Yeah, I am Adam, and I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And primarily, my main motivation behind this is just looking for another avenue of telling Dave how much I hate him. No, but I feel like very much kind of like how you summed it up, Dave, that we live in different cities, and I think that a lot of our views can be very different, but it all kind of like is based on our influence that came probably from a pretty similar foundation. And so just life experiences and such have kind of maybe changed or altered or maybe even like reaffirmed some of those positions. And so it's just good to talk with each other and sort of discuss sort of like that change or development and also make fun of each other. So main motivations there.
Mm-hmm.
And my name is Josh Byers. I live in a suburb of Detroit. Kind of piggybacking off what both of you said. I used to love when we could hang out and talk about life into the wee hours of the night at a cafe, and not have to worry about being up and going to work or taking kids or things. So I thought this was an excellent way we could do that, have a chance to do that, and express what we believe. I think, like Adam said, we all had foundation, and it'd be interesting to see how life kind of takes you and what influenced you to see right now what you believe. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you. Cool. So for the first, I think, opening to this, our topic is about growing up in Christian evangelicalism. And one of the things I wrote down was that, I know we're going to have a lot of topics that are going to be running a course through faith, religion, theology, or topics where those run alongside or other issues into the world and how those sort of things bleed into that. But I think for the first one that we talked about was just the idea that starting from our own context, where we all started from was kind of growing up in this thing called Christian evangelicalism. So let's start there and talk about that. All these questions, by the way, are a guide, so run with them as you like. But the first one was kind of like, so what does that mean to you, like Christian evangelicalism? And when you were being brought up in it, what did it mean? Like, so that I think people can understand and know, like, what do we mean when we say Christian evangelicalism? But then also, like, what did that look like when you were a kid or growing up, teens, adolescents? Josh.
Go ahead, Adam. Yeah.
So, yeah. So, for me, how I was raised, Christian evangelicalism is kind of like the creation, fall, redemption story. God, the Creator, His Son Jesus is like the Redeemer of a fallen world, and how I was kind of taught that when I was growing up was there's a sense of urgency behind not only believing that, but convincing other people to share in that belief as well, like to be very open about your faith and to encourage or convince others of joining that kind of same belief system, possibly your church, but essentially like the belief system itself. And now the motivation behind that, what I was told was always that in joining this, you're helping somebody, like when they die, they'll go to heaven. There was a weird balance between works and grace. And I feel like those were emphasized depending on the person's argument or their point that they were trying to make. It was either there's nothing you can do really that, like, God's the only person that can do that. But then it's kind of like you do something that's maybe against a conduct code or something, and automatically people are questioning whether you're like, whether you believe these things about Jesus or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my upbringing. There was like a sense of urgency because time was running out and the world is going to end, or you're going to die. And when either of those two happen, you want to make sure that you've proclaimed this type of belief set.
Yeah. I would say for me, growing up in an evangelical home, I think it also had a lot to do with what's called like fundamentalism. That there were these fundamentals of the faith that were non-negotiables. You had to believe them. You guys obviously have been exposed to that. One of them is the inerrancy of the Bible, that it's infallible. It's historically true from beginning to end, regardless of what the genres of the books might be. And everything happened just as the Bible says, no debate. And I definitely believed that, and I was kind of caught up in that, and I got to a point where that was what I wanted to defend at all costs. And the more I knew about that, and the more I could not only defend it but show others that they were wrong, I felt like it like helped me in some way, like it validated my beliefs and me as a person. And because I always thought that what I believed, I wanted it to make sense and to be true, and that I didn't just believe something because I was told it. And but lo and behold, like those things do crumble the more you expose yourself to certain things. So I think just the Bible as a source of truth for everyone at all times and all places was a huge key that I remember most. And I think along with that, what we'll be talking about too, I'm sure, and other topics, is what Adam was saying too about not going to hell. You need to go to heaven. And if you do go to hell, you'll be there forever. So you needed to be right about these things. I thought it was funny. I was talking to my mom. This was actually kind of recently. And it's funny that, like Adam was saying, there's these things that you believe, like grace versus faith. And if I accept Jesus, I'm in. But then at the same time, if I don't believe something, like if I don't believe the Christian story is true, like how much am I really a Christian, or how much do I really believe it? So there's so many of these add-ons, I feel like, in evangelicalism or the fundamental Christian belief, that you say it's great, you're saved by grace through faith in Jesus, but then there's about 20 different add-ons that also come with it. So that's something that stuck out to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I obviously agree with all of that. I think I like one of the things that Adam said about the sense of urgency. And I think Adam, you said something to the effect of like, you have just so much time. Um, and Josh, I think you spoke a lot to like truth claims. And like those two things for me growing up were like big things. Like the idea that like I think my mom said it or my dad or something, but like, like Jesus is coming back in my lifetime. Like that we are on the cusp of the end times, and that like this process is like just about to like go up a level of that, which is to say, and this is a question I have later, but like that there is a war going on. There's a battle, for like the souls of everybody. And so we have to be aware of that and like engaged in that. And the idea that like we're fighting to get the world to recognize the truth of these claims, right? And that included like obviously claims about the Bible, specifically in Jesus and the life and all of that. And then I think like part of that was like how that manifested. I think growing up was two things. One was that everything was kind of a battlefield. So like sin was like everywhere, and you could always be sinning. Like anything you do could be a sin. And that's like a spiritual fight for like your soul and your purity and things like that. But then like there were battles in the exterior world, and that I think kind of speaks to like I think of Christian evangelicalism as kind of being molded obviously by like moral majority in this movement to project the faith into the world, into like the public square, politics, society, culture, etc. And so that's like, so for example, my aunt just this very weekend is at the Ark display in Kentucky, the Can-Am Ark, things like that. Like this is real, this happened. We should have like the Ten Commandments on courts and things like that. And then the Ken Ham thing about that made me think of similar to what Josh talked about. So I don't know if you guys had this, but growing up, we had these videos by Ken Ham, educational videos about creationism, and it's evolution is like a lie from the devil trying to convert you to non-belief, and creationism is the truth, that, and he would espouse that. But on the cover of this video, there's these two little hills, like islands, and there's castles on either one. And one is like a Christian castle, and there's all these turrets, and for some odd reason, the soldiers are blowing up balloons, and the balloons are like truth or like Jesus and things like that. And on the other castle, they're blowing up balloons, and those balloons say homosexuality, pornography, I think like secularism, like all these sort of like idioms of the evil world. And the foundation, the island, was labeled evolution, and the other castle, the foundation was labeled the Bible. And they're shooting cannons from the evolution castle onto the foundation of the Bible, and the Christian castle is shooting at their balloons and like popping, like homosexuality. And it's like, oh, they won that battle, but what's happening is that they're actually attacking this foundation. And like that kind of like painted the world for me, was that like all of these sort of issues in the world are actually tied to this battle for like the Bible, like the truth, and that there is this urgency to like save people, to get them out of hell, to convert them immediately, and to like make sure the world understands and sort of alters their way to like enjoying this. I think that was like the world for me was very much like we would watch something on television and there'd be some political thing, and then immediately we'd start talking about like the devil or like a war, like this is being influenced by evils versus the ways of good in the Bible. Like everything was sort of tied into this narrative for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny you say that. That's one thing I try to completely stay away from is spiritual warfare, because that was the one thing I think that really had a negative impact on me growing up. Like we were allowed to watch things like The Simpsons and stuff growing up. My parents weren't too strict, but it was also kind of odd. We always make fun of my mom about this, but like she's a great mom, good Christian woman, this and that. But the strangest thing, she would let us watch like horror movies like growing up. And I always thought that was the oddest thing, because like I would never like expose my kids to that, but at the same time, maybe I just have
For
like
the
a
record,
sensitive.
we need to put on record that Josh's mom is also a career clown, which adds another layer
That's right. She is. That's true. So she's very diverse and eclectic with the things she enjoys. But I don't know. I must have a sensitive conscience or something because that like totally. I was so scared of like anything that had to do with spiritual warfare and stuff like that. And I remember. I think one other thing that I wanted to mention about evangelicalism is I always thought it was so strange that they promoted kids to pick up and start reading the Bible. Like the Bible is such a diverse, complicated, adult book. And depending on whether or not you're in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and whether you're in youth group, you're 5 years old, you're just supposed to like read it and like nothing will affect you. And I remember I was reading in the New Testament, one of the passages talking about like the unpardonable sin. And I thought I was going to have like a nervous breakdown. Like that totally like shattered my psyche.
Yeah.
Like I was so engulfed in that belief system that if I did this, my eternal fate was already sealed while I'm alive and young, and there's nothing that I can do about it. Like, I don't know. That was just such a horrible memory, core memory that I have of evangelicalism. And I think it's rooted back to this idea of having kids. I'm not going to have my kids read the Bible like unless they're reading it with me and I can like teach them something about it. Like I would never just give my kid a Bible and say, there, have at it, like make the best of it. Like, because I think no matter what we believe, we don't always, I don't know, we don't always come out thinking the best things about what the text says. And so I don't know, that's just something I needed to.
So you're saying,
yeah. Well, it's actually funny that you mentioned that in terms of like exposing some of the parts of the Bible that are definitely kind of like adult oriented. Because I mean, from my unique experience, not even necessarily like my upbringing, but like even mentioning it as a parent from that perspective, our daughter is from China, so she has no religious upbringing whatsoever. She said that she had heard of Jesus as kind of like a historical figure, but they never covered anything significant. And like being a teacher, I kind of like get why you can't actually just have weeks-long lessons explaining like the context and importance of like every figure in history, let alone one in like Western history. But so as a 13-year-old, she joined us, and she's 18 now. And some of her questions for me that were either through Google Translate when she couldn't speak English, and even now when she has a lot of questions, not even about the Bible, but about Christianity in general, were kind of eye-opening, because I realized that like, because I was like brought up in this, I had no exposure to any other kind of worldview in a family's context. And so like, Josh, when you're talking about like the inerrancy of the Bible and all this kind of stuff, like in some weird way, I guess like as a child, I'm supposed to understand like the purpose for the incest story of like Lot and his daughters and stuff. And it's like reading that as an 8-year-old like in church, because I would always just kind of like flip through like different stuff when I was kind of trailing off from the pastor and stuff. And I would like stumble upon these things where it's like, oh my gosh, what in the world is this? But at the same time, it's kind of like one of the first gifts I ever remember getting was a King James version of the Bible when I was like 6 from my grandpa. And he's like, yeah, you got to read this. You got to know it, like all this kind of stuff. And Awana is another like church program that is, I mean, it has some like good components and stuff, but like one of the important principles is like memorizing scripture. And when I was growing up, like all of these like books that they would have you memorize these like portions of the Bible, and we're all in like King James version, which is, if you haven't read it, it's basically like reading Shakespeare. So you have like kids reciting Shakespeare versions of spiritual texts, not really understanding what they mean, but memorizing them really well, maybe getting some kind of meaning here and there. But yeah, so anyway, back to my daughter, it's just like as a adolescent, somebody who can read and understand and have opinions about things, and then also like have a lot of questions about it, it was really kind of eye-opening in terms of like just how sheltered my worldview was, and almost kind of like, I don't want to use the word tainted, but like I even find myself at 37 still trying to like check myself on like, do I really believe that this is true, or is it just something that I've just kind of accepted?
So a couple of things. One, I feel like the takeaway on this is that there should be those parental advisory stickers slapped on every Bible.
That's
Do
true.
not read without an adult present.
I
Right?
agree. At
Yeah.
least certain books, that's for sure.
And I feel like the thing that you talked about, Josh, with like the unforgivable sin, I remember as well, like coming across that and being kind of like, holy shit, have I done that? Like, and not
Right.
know, like,
Right.
did I do this? Like you could, like, just walking down the street, you could turn a corner and run into a huge sin, or like something that would like send you to hell forever. And like, that was, I think, one of the things I was trying to say is that, like, you know, that this idea that like sins are everywhere and you can kind of commit them accidentally. But yeah, I remember reading that and not understanding or knowing, and no one had ever told me what it was, but there
Right.
was this idea that like you could have done it without knowing, you know. And I'm like, so I could be like believing in Jesus and reading the Bible, but I'm already going to hell because I did this one thing accidentally one time.
Right. And I
That,
think
just sorry, but like, yeah, very much like fused into my view, my spiritual view, my psyche about this, and just that like well, I don't want to say walking on eggshells, but like my spiritual life then, I felt like, was afraid that at any moment I'm going to hit a tripwire. Everywhere are tripwires, and like, how do I dance around them? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
and it's funny because up until that time, I think everything was like just ignorance is bliss sort of thing. Like I believed in Jesus, so everything else was cool. And then I like ran into that like a brick wall. I think the thing that made me angry the most about that was like no one could really explain it to me. Here's this thing that depends on, like I said, the fate of our eternal destiny. And I'm like, what does this mean? Did I do it? And like, no one can give me a good answer. Like my mom takes me, I talk to a pastor. He's like, well, you probably didn't do it. I'm like, what? What does this mean? Like, what are you talking about? He's like, I'm sure you didn't do it. Like, yeah. I'm like, well, what? I mean, I don't know. It's so, and these things that are so important to like us as humans and the fate of our existence, and then like no one really knows what it means. That was like just a huge like, well, wait, it can't be like this thing. You know what I mean? Either it doesn't mean what we all think it means, or there's like we're not interpreting it the right way. We're not really understanding it. So I don't know. I just had to put that in there too, like that no one could really clear my conscience. It was almost like through different providential things, which I will like, since I do still believe in God, little providential things that like kind of reassured me here and there, like don't worry type of thing. So
You're not going to hell.
yeah. So, and so I ultimately I was relieved, but still I till this day, if I like something here, I'll like get like trauma like creeping up from like the my brain. But I don't know, it's crazy. It was crazy.
I think one of the things that speaks to that tied into this very thread was that you talked about, like, I remember at times reading like Ken Ham and all that. Like I was raised absolute creationism, and the idea that like non-creationism is lies from Satan to like, pull you away. And so I remember at times like I'm not a creationist now, I'm certainly an evolutionist, but like at times when I was kind of like, well, maybe it wasn't a literal 6 days. Okay, like maybe it didn't happen. This is like more of a metaphorical story. I remember being like, am I losing my faith? Is my Christianity starting to slip? Like all of these structures within the realm were so taught, were like just a domino effect that if you let one tip over, they're all going to fall. And I remember with faith being like, yeah, I don't know if I believe in a literal creation that way, and being like, oh, did I just lose my faith? Like, am I not a Christian anymore? Like, did I just get kicked out? And there's so many of these pillars that like will fall, like that, like, if you abandon one, then you might as well drop them all because you're like it's the unforgivable sin. You're already on the out. And that was like this permanent sort of fear throughout the process of being like anything could trip it, and then I've lost everything.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I guess like kind of, and this isn't like a challenge necessarily, but just like kind of a question that I was
Challenge.
thinking of like while you were talking, was do you think that adults had that same or have that same disposition to like actions and sin in relation to like their Christian beliefs? Because as a child, 100%, like that's something that I identified with. Like there was a lot of guilt, there kind of was a lot of shame, and even kind of like fear of like, um, only God knows your heart. So like who you are, or what you do when nobody else is around, like God is like watching you, and so you better not mess up. Like, and not even to like put my parents like in a bad position, because like I've even said to my own son years ago, thankfully it wasn't like recently, but like I don't know what happened, but you know what, God knows what happened. Like, did he hit his brother in the backseat of the car? Like, I didn't see what happened, but God certainly knows what happened. And like he, to this day, like fesses up to stuff. I mean, he's a very honest kid, and like that's great and that's awesome and everything. But like, it's it's kind of like a system of control. Um, and I would say that um, I didn't know a I didn't know of an adult that has that same kind of disposition. Like I don't. The only thing I've seen it, I guess, like spoken about in a church to an adult audience is talking about like pornography. It's like if it's like you're by yourself and you're like lusting and all this kind of stuff. Like that's what it was. Like you know stuff like an affair involves another person. Like all these other things don't involve just like one person on their own sinning. Yet
Right.
like as a child it's like it's like yeah, if you're smoking, like that's definitely a sin. Like you and your friends going off and like doing this stuff, like, oh, that's God's watching you guys and all this kind of stuff. So like have you guys experienced that, or like have something to share, an example of like how that type of worldview is practiced by adults in their own lives as opposed to controlling their children?
Yeah. So are you asking like, is this hypothesis that adults maybe in our upbringing possibly didn't actually believe it this way, but it was almost kind of like shitty parenting where like, if you don't clean your room, you're going to hell for that. Like definitely like that this theme is sort of woven into like a parental process to just because things are too complex or because kids are too difficult sometimes. And they're like, this is like your soul hangs in the balance. So do this, don't ask questions. And they don't really believe it. Is that sort of
Or not that so much that they 100% don't believe it and like they're kind of in on their own bullshit, but more of like that it's like a cognitive dissonance issue. So it's kind of like they would say like 100%, like God is up in heaven, they're watching you, they can see what you're doing, so when you're messing up, just know that you're not getting away with anything forever, kind of thing. Like, do you think that that was a belief that they held in their own lives that truly guided their actions, or do you think that that was kind of something that was sort of a trump card that they used as a method of control?
For me personally, I would say no, because I think both of my parents really strongly believed in, and well, as much as I could tell, we're under this, umbrella of grace that even if they did do something wrong, or even if they disciplined me for sure, but luckily they never really threw God in my face, like, this might happen or that might happen. And I don't think they thought about it too much either, because, like you get to a certain age and you know your parents aren't perfect and you can see them. And then you're kind of like, man, but if they really believe this, why would they act this way or that way? I'm sure my sons think the same thing, will think the same thing about me. But something that did affect me about that, because they say your earliest perception of like God is your dad, and my dad was a cop. He was very big and like kind of stern. and very like intimidating. So like that was my first impression of God. So even
Well,
if
can we
they
talk a
didn't,
minute on how your dad actually resembles God a little bit when he had the big
Booming voice.
and like the booming voice?
that's right.
Yeah.
That's
No,
true.
but
And I
sorry,
think he
go on.
did play.
Go on.
I think he did play Moses or something in a community
In
theater.
the church plays. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was somewhere along those lines in that role. But yeah, so it just made me have this without them having to say anything, like this thing in my mind about if God is stern or like, so I have to be pleasing to him because he might, be angry with me. So when growing up, I had to really make an adjustment from like, sure, God loves me. Like I know my parents love me, but does God does he like me? You know what I mean? Like, or is he just going to get pissed at me for like spilling potato chips or something? Like, is he like, yeah, you idiot or something? My dad did never call me an idiot, but that whole thing,
He just slowly pulled out his gun on the table.
That's right. I remember this. This is the funniest story. We were 7 years old, my buddy. I spilled chips and like one fell in my hand, and I just looked at my dad, and I just remember him getting like so pissed off at me that I spilled the chips. And that has nothing to do with God, but you can cut that out actually. For this.
Got it.
Got it. Wait, yeah,
Can that actually just be like the opening sequence? Yeah, so my dad freaked out at me for spilling chips. Okay, welcome.
I like how I can hear the singular use there. You're like, so I spilled chip.
It was literally like, no, like the chips fell, like one landed in my hand. And I just looked at my dad. My friend was like laughing at me. And then my dad was so pissed about that. To remember, like, you just have those vivid memories in your head. That was something that stood out. So I'm like, God must be like that. You spill a whole thing of chips and SOL,
I think for me, I think I would kind of harken back to what Josh said. And like, I don't said earlier, like, I don't think it's the BS. I don't think that they don't necessarily believe it. I think what it is this, and I think within like evangelicalism specifically, maybe there is that urgency that to instill in your children to like pass on the truth. And my parents would always quote this one verse about like they're responsible for the upbringing of their children. Like God will be pissed at parents if they don't rear their children in the word properly. And so I think there's that push of like, well, we have to like cram all this truth into you. And like we talked about, is like, this stuff is complicated. And some of this stuff is maybe not fit for children. And so they just sort of do a very simplified version of it. And here's like a glossary summary. And it's just like this. And so I think I don't want to say like it's parental apathy or something, but it's more of you're condensing really complex issues that, like, I think both of you talked about, like Adam specifically, like your kid hears these things and they're like, okay, so I have a million questions about this now. And you're just kind of like, it's 1 + 1 = 2. That's it. And as I think the parent, though, is walking around with a more complicated understanding and balancing some of these things a little bit differently. And so they're like living it in a complicated manner, and their children are seeing that, but they have this very childlike, preschool understanding of these very complex truths. And I think that's maybe where they see this difference, or this, like, not like a BS system, but that you're telling me these things like this, and you don't really seem to like see them the same way or think of them the same way or maybe even live them the same way. Maybe because some don't, but I mean, I think for myself, my upbringing, my parents adamantly, totally believed all of this. But I think they had a much more like graduated level of understanding, even though I think their approach to it is pretty, I don't want to say childlike, but like simplistic. Like anytime I would ever have debates with my mom about anything like Bible or belief, she would just be like, well, if that's what God said, or like if it's in the Bible. And I'd be like pointing out things. I'm like, okay, this verse and this verse contradict each other. They can't both be true. And she's like, oh, if that's what God wanted. And so like there's that fallback of just copping out on these matters. But I think I heard like a very baby version when I was a kid. And as I got older, I started hearing more complicated versions, more complex things. Maybe it was as I asking more complicated questions, they're like, okay, so here's the issue with that.
Yeah.
So
I think, yeah, to kind of go along with your point about like oversimplified versions of things, I kind of think that, I don't have a ton of like vivid memories of like to cite examples of what my teaching was like at church or whatever in terms of like biblically or theologically at a young age. I do remember quite a bit more like when I was a teenager and stuff. But the things that I remember most about my younger years was emphasis on the Bible being 100% true, like how you guys said, like with being 100% literal, historically accurate, all those kind of things. And I guess maybe looking back and thinking about it, it wasn't so much trying to oversimplify the Bible necessarily, but using the stories in the Bible that the people believe to be like 100% historically accurate as kind of like fables. You hear the story of Joseph. That's something that you can teach kids in 30 minutes while their parents are in a different part of the church learning something else. And it can keep them entertained, and it can kind of like teach them about the Bible, and then everybody goes home. And so I think, really just kind of recognize it in my son right now, who's reading. Have you guys heard of Percy Jackson? It's
yes. It's like a Harry Potter thing.
Yeah, it is, but it's like a kid has a connection to Greek mythology. And so that's kind of sent him on a rabbit trail of like reading all these stories about Greek mythology, which the same thing can be said about the Bible. Like, wow, there's some stuff in there that I don't know that I want you to know about.
A little rapey, this section.
But there's fortunately, like he only wants to read like the Greek mythology that's been written by the guy who's been writing these series of books. But also it kind of just like wakes me up to this idea of what kind of drew me to the Bible wasn't necessarily like this truth, this yearning for like understanding the world. It was more of just like kind of reading these cool stories. Like David and Goliath, like Samson, like those are cool stories, like as a kid, and like even as adults, just kind of read them. They're entertaining. Yet when I became older, like I'm not going to go to a church that's teaching adults about Samson, most likely, or like David and Goliath, or they'll reference Joseph, or like, but the focus will be on something else and not so much like the narrative part of it. And so to talk about how things are oversimplified in terms of our upbringing, like I think that it was, but the purpose was just give them scripture. Okay, what's scripture that like a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old could sit and listen to? Oh, this is a really good story. This would be fun. We could tell it in an interesting way, or just have them be quiet and not to distract their parents. So that's kind of like my thoughts on that. Like the oversimplification of the Bible, I feel like is tapping into another segment of this where we talk about maybe consumerism or culture wars or things like that kind of address more of like the adult experience of oversimplification of the Bible. What's that?
Put it in the queue.
I'll put it in the queue. Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, on that, there's one more question I really want to get to that we unpack, but I think and I think that maybe is. I think that's unavoidable in a way. Like you can't sit down and teach complex theology to a child and be like, well, let's approach this hermeneutically, this text, that's not going to work. But I think like in ways it almost kind of does lead to the problems a little bit later, because like growing up, so I'm David, I'm named after the guy in the Bible. My parents told me all the time. And so I read these super interesting and exciting stories about David. And then as I get a little older, I come across the passage where like he lusts after a woman and then like just has her come to his house and kind of has sex with her. It never records whether she was cool with that or consented. And then he's like, hey, let's go kill her husband so I can have her permanently. And so then I'm now trying to like grapple with this, like, okay, so here's this thing about this guy. Like, I don't understand. How do I comport that with this sort of mythology of this guy, the way he's been built up and things like that? Or just reading other stories that then, like I hear these. So Job is a really good one that like people talk about, like, here's this man who is faithful to God and he's put through all these trials and tribulations and he maintains his faith to God. But then there's like elements in it that are so strange that like I think in my adolescence as I was getting older, they kind of just like hung there in my mind just like nagging at me that I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I know I've heard the explanation of this story, and I'm not saying that's not it, but there's more here. Like, what is this? And I feel like that's where then later on, the child, as it grows up, it's kind of comes back and is like, okay, but like, if Jesus is a man, how is he also God? Like, and who's the Holy Spirit? Is this pantheism? And your parents are like, no, 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 no. And you're like, okay, well, then it doesn't make sense. Like, it kind of leads you to grow out of those simple explanations, and then you come back with all those questions. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
maybe where this grapples with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Josh.
No, the only thing that I was thinking about this topic was I sometimes think, why didn't I see my parents like reading or studying the Bible more? Like if the Bible was like the source of truth, as
Wait a minute.
said.
Are you saying you didn't have family Bible studies at 6 a.m. every day?
No, yeah, we were like,
you missed out on a roller coaster.
Right. We were like moderate. I feel like moderate evangelicals were like our church. We went to church. That was very important. But home life, we would say grace at home. Sometimes we might say grace when we went out to eat, but not all the time. But I was like, when I was a little older and I started reading the Bible more for myself, I thought like, well, if this is the text for the whole world and it's absolutely true, why isn't everyone just like engulfed in it all the time? You know what I mean? Like, this is the source of truth. Why am I not engulfed in it? Why are my parents not engulfed in it? So that always just struck me as very interesting. Like, why don't we take it more seriously then? Why doesn't the church take it more seriously then? And then I would just get sidetracked. Well, maybe, it is true, but there's things in there that are uncomfortable for people to read and they don't really want to change. Maybe they're comfortable in like intellectual, consent to believing certain things, but if it affects too much of who I am as a person and how I have to live, and not meaning being against like same-sex marriage or abortion, like the two biggest evangelical like more ethical issues, but really like how I treat people that don't agree with me, or I treat people who don't like me, or just to reshape who you are. And I thought, well, that's got to be it then, right? Like, people don't really want to get in the Bible because if they really get too much like Jesus, then our life would have to change. Even my life, all of our lives would have to change, of where we live or the money we make or don't make. In my case, all might really affect us. So I don't know. That was kind of like something that passed through my head when I was thinking about the Bible and that topic. So
yeah, I mean, like for me, it was actually something that was like very, very present in my upbringing. Like every single night when I was a child, and even like when I graduated high school was kind of when this tradition stopped because I moved out of the house. But like every single night we would pray before we went to bed, and it would be me and my siblings. And like when my sister was too young, like she went to bed earlier, but my younger brother would be there, my older brothers, and like all of us would take turns praying aloud. Now, if we were coming home late from something, usually it was a church function, my dad would just pray and then we would go to bed. But there was probably a handful of times my entire life, the first 18 years of my life, where we didn't pray as a family together before we went to bed. And my dad was still, he actually showed it to me. It was pretty cool because it's kind of like a journal, but like he has a spreadsheet on his computer that's been his prayer list that he's kept for as long as he's had Excel. So like we're talking probably like about 30 years where he's been like keeping this like prayer list and stuff. So it 100% was very present in my life. And so maybe that's kind of why I came to sort of this position of questioning a lot of things later in life. But I do kind of think as I got older, sort of that sense of urgency kind of started to like die down once you sort of realize like, oh, I actually, from a psychological standpoint, like I cannot physically or emotionally care this much about every single human that I come across. Like, whether it's a friend who's an atheist or whether it's somebody who's behind me like in the coffee line, like to not just like turn around and ask them if they know Jesus. Like you physically and emotionally don't have that much like space to carry that kind of burden. But I mean, ultimately that was sort of something that I thought about, like I didn't really kind of check myself on until I was probably like in my 20s. So in terms of like presence in my life, it was a huge part of it. Yeah.
I think, what I find interesting is that I think that you again spoke about like urgency, and I think that was like right there in everything in a little way, because this idea is that like, every moment you're kind of on, and you're either, or at least this is how I felt, was like I'm either like improving myself spiritually, like with my relationship with Jesus, or I'm like carrying out a task. Like you said, like I'm either ministering to somebody, I'm witnessing to somebody. And if I'm not doing those things, then I need to be like improving myself. And one of the things that like Josh, I very much felt that like, well, like looking around and be like, why isn't everyone doing this? It doesn't seem like they are, and I know I'm not always doing it, but like, why doesn't this seem more important? And I know this is probably a little too like behind the curtain on some things, but like this was like the big Keith Green thing. Like Keith Green was just huge about like, you should be living, if you believe these things, then you should be doing it all the time because it's the most important thing. There shouldn't be anything in your life that isn't in some way about this, like living the life. And that was like, it really resonates with me. And I was like, I should be doing this. And then like, I wouldn't, and I'd fail. And I'd be like, I went out and I saw a secular movie with my friends, and we just went and drank coffee, and like, that was it. I didn't like grow in some way. And then feeling like I'm not living up to this, and like questioning why, and looking around and be like, well, they say they love God, but like, I don't see them doing half of the like spiritual processes. Like they didn't witness to that guy or whatever it is. Like, they're not really living it out. And I think that was like a part of the process of me questioning this modality of living, like evangelicalism and that. So I think both of you guys, especially what Adam just said, like leads me to kind of like one of the final questions, which is, do you guys still, I'm assuming you did because like it's the world you grew up in, but like, do you guys still think of yourself as evangelical? And if you don't, like, what is it about evangelicalism specifically that you're like, that I'm not, because I'm not this, or I don't feel like I have to convert every single person, or I don't think that like the Bible's literal, or like, what are the tenets that you're just like Adam seemed to be saying, like, I just can't be on all the time with these things. So like, I believe, and I believe in the Bible, Jesus Christ is my savior, but I'm not that, meaning evangelical.
Yeah. Well, I would say I'm definitely not evangelical in the cultural sense of the word. I believe the Bible does have special relevance, obviously, for the Christian tradition. I look at it a lot more realistically as people that wrote down things as they thought God was at the time. Like, for instance, I don't think God is necessarily like violent. I think like people in the Old Testament had to write what they were experiencing and needed God on their side, just like we do to rationalize stuff that we believe, especially evangelicals in America, about holy wars or liberating people for democracy, or us being in the right and other countries always being in the wrong. But I do still believe that there's a special revelation of God in Jesus. I do believe in a bodily resurrection. But the thing that makes me be able to maintain Christian faith, and this has been a long process, I'm sure we can talk about other topics regarding this, is I went from having to believe, like thinking I had to believe that some people were in hell forever, to, well, maybe it's a lot more lenient than I think it is, to maybe God just annihilates the wicked and people who don't go to heaven just don't exist anymore, to now believing in some form of Christian universalism where everyone's still saved in Christ. God will be all in all, but that might not happen in the short amount of time we're given. But in order for this story, and I've been convinced by different people that I've read, that the story of Christianity can only make sense is if God chose to create people knowing that bad things would happen in order to save them all and allow them to experience union and bliss with him eventually. And I definitely know that evangelicals, at least most, do not agree with that or think that it's some form of heresy. And I think the last thing is just the whole political thing. I'm completely against mixing Christianity with politics. I think that the message of Jesus was very countercultural and anti-empire, and that it can coincide with American interests and American dominance and all that good stuff. I mean, I'm happy I live here. I mean, we get to benefit from a lot of things, but I just don't think Jesus and the state really mix too well. So that's probably where I'm at now.
So, real quick before Adam goes, so I'm hearing properly. So it sounds like you're saying it's the three main tenets for you that were incompatible with your views and evangelicalism was like absolute like scriptural literalism, the political bent of evangelicalism feeling like it needs to put itself, I don't want to say force, I'm trying not to say the word for it, but like project and advocate for itself into the world, that Christian evangelicalism should be represented in the public sphere, and then hell and damnation. Is that like those are the three main things that are very core to evangelicalism that you're like, I don't hold those things. Everything else I'm on board with, but because of those things, I'm not evangelical. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would agree. And I hell thing is definitely by far the most important, my biggest struggle. That's what made me, I think, fall away from my faith for a while, and then the other approaches is what brought me back. So that's definitely first. I think the biblical literacy aspect, all that stuff, is second. Politics it's third, but I think it's like a far third. Like, I don't really think about. I mean, I think about politics in that I want the best for our of the world, not just in America thing, but I try to stay out of even thinking about evangelicals in the political sphere because it just kind of makes me frustrated and angry. So it's there, but I try not to consume a lot of energy on it.
Right. Okay. And Adam, while you're still on your Steve Zazu kick.
So Jacques Cousteau. So I think that I agree a lot, or I share a lot of the same kind of perceptions that Josh just described. I will say, I'm finding myself kind of not spending a lot of time or energy contemplating certain components of the Christian faith. For me, the idea of heaven and hell are kind of like I think mainly because of like this whole idea of salvation. Well, to boil it down, I believe like the moral supremacy of Christianity doesn't really hold up. Or I would maybe not supremacy, but like the singular nature of Christianity being like the only moral code somebody should follow, which I think that a lot of American evangelicals would agree with. To me, has kind of challenged my faith probably more than anything. The older I get and kind of the work that myself and my wife do, where we encounter a lot of people who are religious but not Christians, has really kind of like challenged me on some of those preconceived moral assumptions. And of course, like growing up, like there wasn't a lot of diversity that I was around in terms of faith. And so like you kind of grow up in this with this worldview of that, like you kind of have the answer and everybody else is lost or everybody else is sinful. And in some cases, like other religions are extremely violent in nature. And so that to me has really kind of like challenged it. I don't see things in the teachings of Jesus, which I think are the most important parts of the Bible, to be lining up necessarily with what the religion of Christianity emphasizes now. So I think that I'm kind of at this point where I'm really kind of differentiating between religion and faith. I still kind of consider myself a person of faith. I do not consider myself an evangelical, mainly because I think that sort of like the components of what it means to evangelize Christianity is starting with this point that Jesus is like the only answer for everything you have in your life, you know, your moral code, your eternity, your purpose, everything like that. Because I've just happened to meet so many people who don't share that religion, but who are amazing people, whether they're Buddhist or Muslim or Sikh, it doesn't matter. I just found people who subscribe to a different faith, yet live lives that I feel are more in line with what the expectations of Jesus were, as opposed to many people that would subscribe to evangelical Christianity. So I feel like I'm kind of in this redefining. I mean, like the word deconstructionist is thrown around a lot right now with a lot of people who were kind of brought up in the church and like figuring out, okay, like, is this something that I believe to be true? Or simply that I have questions about these kind of things that are, you know, not so much like how many colors were on Joseph's coat, but more of like, did Jesus actually physically raise from the dead? Like that's hard to just like simply accept because because the scripture is saying that it does, you know, because it's kind of like it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's kind of just like, I guess it's a little bit of a bias, like using the Bible as a method to convince somebody that something in the Bible happened or is true is sort of like, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's so anyway, to get to the point, that's really where I'm at, of like having a significant amount of questions, still going to church, and really loving the church body that I'm a part of, but also having some significant questions about some of the things that I take exception to or have a hard time believing or simply am really significantly questioning at this point. So I would still identify myself as a person of faith. I would identify as a Christian, but not a fundamentalist, and maybe kind of more on the end of like a universalist. That kind of spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think, I mean, my process, I think, mirrors both of those obviously very similarly. And what's interesting is I don't think it's uncommon. I think at a pretty young age, I think the political dynamic was really unpalpable to me. I remember just at a young age, I mean, like I'm not trying to cast aspersion, but like my dad, for example, and I think I've told you guys both, did a VHS recording from television of the 2.5-hour special about Ronald Reagan's death, like, and his funeral. Just like it's literally like 45 minutes of just a car going down a street, you know, like. And so there's obviously this very strongly married political and religious aspect. And I think from early age, I was just like, I don't like that. I don't know why. I don't have an articulated defense, but like that's just not vibing with me. And so I think that was very quick. And then I think the questions about I don't know if I buy all of the stories about the Bible. Like this is literal. Like, this actually happened. What about other dynamics? And then that led me into questioning, I think, a larger scope to what both of you kind of spoke to, especially like Adam there at the end, was where I started looking into a lot of other religions, and I was really drawn to like people like the Buddha and Gandhi, and thinking like these are like amazing people, and they seem to be living out this very similar track to Jesus, but they didn't call themselves Christians. And so like, are they going to hell? Because I know some big a-holes at my church that I think should go to hell, and you're saying they're not, but like Gandhi did. And I'm Adam, and like I was living in Grand Rapids at the time when Rob Bell came out with that book, like Love Wins, which said that like I can't remember somebody that Gandhi went to heaven before somebody else, like Mother Teresa or something. I don't remember, but like it was a very like tense moment within the realm because people like he's saying a non-Christian went to heaven, and that was like a big conflict. And I think that was part of my process of being like finding people that mirrored what I thought Jesus was like, even though they didn't classify those labels on themselves. Gandhi was, I think, Gandhi has all these pithy things that supposedly he said, but including like, I love your Jesus. I wish your Christians were more like him type thing. And then I did like, what was it, the Donald Miller thing where I was like, I'm not a Christian anymore because Christians, that's a bad label. Everyone's going to associate me with these people. I'm not. I'm like a Jesus follower because that's a trendy thing. And then thinking about these other sort of religious views that are very dramatically different. Some ways they're similar, and meeting people and finding their philosophical views and being like, how can that be? How can I just be like, well, you go to hell? Like, sorry, that's just the rules, and that's the way it's going to happen. And I think I started to lose those things, and obviously my apostasy took a much larger turn. But yeah, I think it was just the idea of like, I can't reconcile these things with my understanding of either the theological implications that are espoused by God. God is loving. How can he do that? So those things can't be true. And then just, I think meeting people and meeting, like Adam, you talked about, like my world and the people in them got much larger suddenly. And I was like, okay, now I have to incorporate all of this greater complexity of people and worlds and views and cultures, and they don't really fit into that singular frame. And so the idea of damnation, the idea of the Bible being a literal account, historical thing, and then the political dynamics, just all that kind of fell away pretty quickly. And then meeting people, I just felt like, yeah, I can't incorporate that system. And so I think what's interesting is that I think I started realizing that on some of those things, I intellectually rejected them, and other ones I just realized like I kind of lost them. Like I suddenly just was like, yeah, I don't think you go to hell. Yeah. And that's not a conscious decision. I just don't believe that you do. Mm. And it just sort of like the belief that I had, which was, well, you can be great, but you're going to hell, like kind of just disappeared. And I said like, oh, I don't have that anymore. So yeah, I think it mirrored a lot of what you guys just both spoke about. So,
yeah. So do you think, what do you think, Dave, kind of made, was there a single question, or do you think it kind of came as sort of like a series of like experiences or whatever that were all kind of happening kind of around the same time where you made that shift? Because heaven and hell has certainly come up a lot. And I would say kind of for me, what started that, I would say my belief or my worldview shift was creation. But very quickly followed by, because I think the book, there was like a counter book to Rob Bell's book. I never actually read that. What was the name of Rob Bell's book again?
Love Wins.
Yeah. Okay, because I did read the counter book to that.
Which was what?
It doesn't. Erasing Hell by Francis Chan.
Oh, yeah. Francis Chan. Okay.
Yeah. And I read some of his other books too, but I mean, that one for me, I felt like was so, I just like remember that book like so much because there was, again, there's this underlying theme of urgency within evangelicalism. because of this fear of like, if you die or if the tribulation starts, part of the Christian faith of Jesus returning to gather his living followers along with his followers who have died, and like joining him in heaven and erasing sin and all that kind of stuff for in terms of finality. So because of that, there's this like very quickly published book called Erasing Hell. And I felt like while I was reading that, like never having really read Rob Bell at that point and not really kind of like following him too much, because he sort of seemed like what would be like the archetype of like the YouTube preacher, like really wanting to be cool and kind of package Christianity as being like very relevant and like trendy. But like kind of like recognizing, well, he actually does have some really good points, because if it comes like this, the crux of like salvation, what sends you one way or another in terms of your soul or of eternity is like doing something, like doing a prayer or accepting something, and then you're on the road to heaven, and like everything else you do in your life is completely forgiven. Just like that just sort of started to kind of like chip away at this whole like this foundation of this religion that I was raised in. But like for you, was there like a certain thing around that like moment, or was it just sort of like an evolution?
I mean, yeah, I think that there were probably moments. I think if we were to sort of graph it out, I think that there were a lot of moments. There were probably big blips. But I think it was an evolution. It was a process of many, many things. And I mean, like, it just even one simple question at first about like, well, if not that, then what? And then where? And how do and just like sort of suspending belief in certain things like heaven and hell, and being like, I don't think I can buy hell, or that people go, or who everyone says goes and why. And like, okay. And then the fact that I could simply suspend it meant that I could very soon sort of like, just like let go of it. And so meaning that there were times that I was like, I don't know what I think about that. And I had that for, let's say, a year or two. And then I was like, I don't think I believe it at all. So it wasn't just like an overnight rejection. It was like, I don't know if I still hold that. Maybe. Yeah, I think it was an evolutionary process of just bit by bit, question and question sort of thing. And I'm not even sure of the context of what are you asking about that within evangelicalism, within faith, within dogmatism?
I mean, just kind of like, well, because I think those all sort of go together. I think that like evangelicalism is pretty dogmatic in its structure. It's not really, I would say there's nothing in evangelical Christianity that leaves anything up to perception. It's very much like concrete. Passages of the Bible or components of that belief structure are challenging in the expectation of how someone lives their life. So kind of like and difficult in terms of moral standards, not necessarily like difficult philosophically.
I would say one is an analogy that I thought of that I think works, and the others, I remember very distinctly when I first started taking, classes at a collegiate level about comparative religion and theology and the philosophy of religion, and the structure in which like all basic religion systems are sort of categorized as these things. So like Judaism is very big on history and text, right? It's very big that God intervened in history and that they have this textual, the written record of it. Islam is very big on submission, right? God is God. You're not submit to that process. Some Eastern religions are very big on harmony and things like that. Christianity is very big on truth claims. And so that is their dynamic. And so I very much felt like these things are true. There is no gray here. They are true. And you either accept that truth or you reject that truth. And so the analogy, I thought it was like, I think all of like specifically the forms of evangelicalism that I was brought up in always kind of felt like an outfit that didn't fit. It was put on me. I had it on, and there was all this sort of truth and moralizing process of like, if you take it off, you go to hell. And so I didn't want to take this off, but it wasn't until I realized after I did that I was like, that never fit. That never felt comfortable. I just always had it on, and I thought I had to have it on. And so, yeah, like the minute I kind of jettisoned one thing, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's not bad. Like, I can still believe in Jesus and not think X about this, or like, I can accept, for example, like evolution, and that doesn't mean I'm going to hell or that you're going to hell because. So I think as I did that, I realized like, oh, like this was actually really uncomfortable. This wasn't me. But the problem was that I think it's very built on, especially evangelicalism. I think that there are other forms of faith within Christianity that aren't that strident or stringent with it. But I think it's all underpinned by their truth claims, right? Jesus lived, he died for your sins, he rose again. As Paul says, like if he didn't rise and die, then what's our faith's worthless. Like that these are truth claims, and the Bible is the recording of that truth. And so if you don't accept those things, well, then you're just like someone who doesn't believe this. And so I think that was what made it very difficult to sort of like overcome that hill, to get over the truth type thing. So, any final thoughts, words, insults?
I wish I believed in hell so that I could be guaranteed that you'd be going there.
That's a good one.
Don't encourage him.
I like that. That was good.
Zing.
If I could believe one thing in life, it'd be that hell existed. So it goes there. That was good, Adam. I like that.
Okay. All right. All right, cool. Well, then I would say we can wrap this up then. This will be the completion of the very first one. I hope those for the 3 people, including like my mother who hear this, enjoyed that and thought that it was helpful. I think the process of our growing up and living in evangelicalism, and I think looking at it, trying to analyze it critically and figure out what works and doesn't work for ourselves. Yeah. So until next time, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.